Let's start with how you define
Well,
shame.
I define shame. Shame lives in the brain, and recent research has shown that it lives in the basal ganglia, which is just above the limbic system in our brain. That's our seat of emotion. As an affect, and as you and I talked earlier, affects are like pre-emotions. It informs us that something is happening. We just really don't know what. If it's shame, we'll know shame, because when shame is triggered, it affects our sense of self, who we are.
And you make an interesting distinction, an important distinction between shame and guilt.
Shame and guilt are absolutely not the same, and I hope your listeners understand and never use shame coterminously or the same sense as guilt, because they're different. Shame is about our sense of self. It is when it is invoked or triggered, if you will. It causes us to feel something about us. We want to disappear. We want to become invisible, because it affects something about our sense of self in the world.
In other words, because I feel ashamed, I believe that I'm a bad person.
That there's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. I'm just not okay. Guilt, on the other hand, is a learned behavior, if you will, and it's when we feel guilt, it's we have broken a learned value, and we may sense anxiety.
And typically, people develop this affect of shame in early childhood.
It usually begins very early. Shame, of course, we're all born with the ability to have shame, however. But for many kids who are raised in abusive environments, neglectful environments, environments where they are abandoned, abused, violated in some way, that creates a trauma, okay? An early life trauma. Usually it's before language. Language develops the first half of the second year of life. So when shame is triggered, or violations to the child's sense of self, safety and security happen, a child will have these memories, may not remember exactly what triggered it, but they know something has happened that affects their sense of self. They never learn to self-soothe. And that's a primary issue I see clinically. So what do? Where do they run? Because we see that 100% of shame-based individuals typically have addiction or emotional mood or some type of emotional problem.
They tend to shut down emotionally.
They shut down, and they look for soothing, self-soothing in the form of pills, liquid, alcohol.
The inner pain is so great.
That's right.
That they're not even able to talk about it.
That's right. So they go to that place where we call self-love, liquid love, and that's alcohol. But we find that 100% of my addict patients have toxic shame. Toxic shame is something else, and that's 100% of the of people with addictions, mood disorders, or personality disorders suffer some form of toxic shame. They just, Jeff, they never feel good enough about themselves.
And the shame gets reinforced through self-talk.
Everybody has self-talk.
That inner voice.
That inner voice, and oftentimes people with toxic self-talk have that toxic shame going on. You're not good enough. It's like an endless loop. And where does this come from? Do children create this on their own? No. It's usually taken in by an adult. Adults say you're not good enough, or stay away from me. We don't want to have time with the child. Whatever that child feels neglected or violated or abandoned, that child's self-talk is going to be really, really bad.
They internalize the harsh voice of a parent.
You can't deal with it through cognitive behavioral therapy, because the minute I started, my patients would bolt. The minute when they started to talk about their wound and the violations, and if I jumped into it like a cognitive behavioral therapist, they would bolt.
And the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy being, well, you just need to readjust your thinking.
Yeah, you know, Bobby, you're really not a bad boy, so why don't we try to adjust that sound in your head? Never worked. Never worked. Because the individual has to expunge. They have to relieve themselves of that toxic wound. And one way to do it is through what I call compassion-based relational therapy, because you have to relate to the patient at their level. You still have to be in charge, kind of, but you have to relate to the patient at their level so they can express their shame. And until and unless they can express their shame, and what manifestation it takes, what form it takes, they're not going to release it at all.
It's about processing the, as you call it, the affect, the precursor to the emotion.
Absolutely.
Which is something very, very deep inside the brain.
It's very deep inside the brain. It's a wound, if you will. But that wound can be healed, and that's the good news here. And it's not, really, it doesn't take years and years and years, like Freud talked about. It doesn't take that much time at all. What it really takes is an intense focus on the traumas. Because unprocessed trauma and unprocessed grief lead to toxic shame.
Well, there are many popular approaches that don't quite get at it. One of them is the use of affirmations as a way of correcting negative self-talk.
Affirmations do not work, and I'm going to take a lot of ridicule, and people, but I can confront it in a positive, in a clinical way. That affirmations might work later on in treatment, just as cognitive behavioral therapy might work later on in treatment.
But when you're dealing with that deep, toxic emotion, it requires a level of processing that, and in order for a person to feel safe to do that, you've got to create a compassionate space.
And that space may look something like having them write a letter to the abuser. In the framework of that letter, he was able to cry and scream and yell at her and release a lot of the stuff. Now we're able to talk about it. But prior to that, he was working out, he was building his body, he was doing everything on the outside to bolster himself, and bolster his ego, and make himself feel good. But he was still a falling down drunk and had been a drunk for 25 years, an alcoholic. But he is no longer drinking. He's in the program. He's going to AA religiously. But he was able to release the wound by writing a letter. We've done some other kinds of things like visualizations and bringing him into a space where he can see her and talk to her and confront her as an adult. And be at 6 or be at 12 or 13 in his case. Be at that age, but use your adult voice and confront her. But compassion is that other affect that I find so important, because to me, it's the driving force in treatment. And what makes up compassion? One is, you have to be on the ground with your person. So you have to have attunement. You have to be attuned to who they are. And the other one is empathy, empathic understanding. But even more important than the other, we have to have that for ourselves. Because unless we have attunement and compassion with ourselves and have a dialogue with ourselves, because most people don't even talk to themselves in a positive and healthy way. They don't check themselves out. But I find that the more I go through these processes that I'm looking at and that I have helped develop, I think that I find that I am a happier guy. My patients seem happier with themselves because they are attuning with themselves. They have permission to talk to themselves in a positive and healthy, proactive way. We're not going to live in this world unscathed. Things are going to happen to us. It's how we process and deal with it. But the deeper part of all of that, compassion is love. And I think that love is that guiding thing, because we can't project love unless we feel it toward ourselves. We can't have a healthy relationship unless we have internal self-love. But if you have that nasty voice in your head barking at you all the time, it's going to be very difficult to project anything but nasty or your own self-loathing. I think that the goal that I employ and look at in my work is love. It really is, at the end of the day, that patients begin to love themselves in a healthy way. We live in a world where self-love is not really a healthy thing to talk about, because we become branded as narcissistic. And that's not a good word, because we pretty much have a narcissistic society. And I think our culture is a culture of narcissism.
So how do you distinguish between self-love and narcissism? narcissism?
Well, because self-love is honest. It's on the ground. You feel it. And it informs you, makes you happy. Okay? Narcissism doesn't make anybody happy. Actually, narcissism is like a defense.
Let's suppose that I'm having a lot of negative self-talk.
Right.
How can I be compassionate toward myself?
Well, you really can't, because that negative self-talk blocks everything internally that's warm and fuzzy. You can't even feel it. Yeah. So we really have to talk about, Jeff, what happened to you? You know? Where did you come from? Who violated you? And maybe you want to write down your, certain, your life as you know it, your timeline of your life. And those areas, those things that happened to you, those traumas, those triggers, if you will, that happened to you early along. Like, how did your mom talk to you? How did your dad talk to you? Were they even there? Who raised you? What was the environment like? Let's get into that. Did you have friends? Were your parents social people? All of these things measure up. They all matter. And I think therapists will begin to look at these markers along the road of life to see where trauma existed. And how the child reacted to those traumas.
But isn't it the case that in almost every form of psychotherapy it starts out with a kind of life history?
It does, but in many respects, I don't think we've used that life history in a healthy way. It kind of tells us who's your mom, who's your dad, are they still living, what was your relationship? But the history of abuse is very important, and many therapists don't do that, because that's what I'm looking at all of the time now. What is the history of abuse? Write down your history. Who did what to you? When did this happen? How old were you? And how did you react to it?
Well, you pointed out earlier that when you began your therapeutic practice using cognitive behavioral therapy, 40% of your patients would reach a certain point of crisis, I suppose. That's right. And they would bolt.
That's right. And especially those patients of mine that were in 12-step programs, and the most important time that they would bolt was when it came to spirituality, and they couldn't touch it because it is so, they couldn't get their head around spirituality because they were hardcore, they were driven, but they weren't into a place where they could understand what is spirituality, what does it mean? What does it mean to feel spirit? What does it mean to float? What does it mean to have a dream? What does it mean to have a fantasy? Realizing, my God, I'm losing all these patients. I'm losing them because they're not dealing with their trauma. And once we can get to that trauma, we're on the road to recovery.